Hello, welcome to episode 10 of the Snare Virtuoso podcast. My name is Jonathan Curtis, and today the topic of the episode is really very simple. I'm just going to share some advice. I've sat and I've written a list of all of the things that I could think of that have been the most helpful to me, things that I have done that have really worked and I think elevated me to levels I really didn't think I would be able to achieve once upon a time. So the list in question is sitting here in front of me on a nice notepad, and it covers a broad range of topics, things you would expect, some things maybe you wouldn't necessarily expect. And these are things that I have compiled that if I could sort of give a self-contained package to a young drummer or a student or someone really looking to transition into this discipline, what are some of the most important things I would say to them to really help them get started or progress in the way they might want to? So that's really what I'm going to be working through today. Before we get started, we're going to listen to some of the repertoire, as usual. We're going to dive into the British military tradition today. We're going to listen to quite a famous piece called McAlpine. Now, this is attributed to a certain A. Piner. Information about whom is very hard to find, so I really can't tell you much about this person. But this is generally attributed to a traditional piece these days. It's a very old piece as far as I can ascertain, very common in the cadet branches, very common in marching and military contexts here in the UK. So let's have a listen to McAlpine by this A. Piner and enjoy it. There we have McAlpine by A. Piner, a traditional piece common over here in the British military. Now, let's get started then. As I say, I've got a nice little digital notepad sitting here on my desk in front of me with some scrawled notes of advice and things I would give to people really looking to improve their work on the snare drum. And I'm going to dive in. A lot of them are linked, but I have made it a numbered list, but it's not strictly delineated here. Now, the first and the most important, the biggest piece of advice I would give to anybody, I am sure those of you who have listened to my podcasts before or seen my videos or read my books or ever met me in person will be able to guess what this is. Say it with me loud and proud. Engage with the repertoire. There is nothing you can do more important when learning an instrument than engaging with the established repertoire, learning it, practicing it, performing it, studying it, and everything else, analysing it, engaging with it in every possible way. I will die on this hill. I will repeat it till the day I die. It is the best way to improve your knowledge, your ability, your understanding, your technique, and of course your musical performance generally. That's not to say you shouldn't do other things, you shouldn't practice exercises and things like that, but ultimately, the snare drum is no different to any other instrument. It is a repertoire-based piece of musical equipment. It is there to perform a task. It is there to perform music. Now, it wasn't necessarily always like this. I'm writing about this in the history section of my Rudimental Drummer book at the moment, a forthcoming publication about rudimental drumming. The drums, or the snare drum at least, was specifically originally a functional instrument. It served to give signals and beatings and convey orders and communicate to large bodies of people over large distances. It had to be loud, it had to be recognizable and easily understandable. But we've come a long way since then. And even from the early days, there are pieces from Philidor and others from the 1700s, named pieces from the 1800s that are still performed to this day. The compositional tradition on the snare drum is vast and varied, and it constitutes the actual act of performing. We generally, this isn't strictly true all the time, but we generally don't improvise on the snare drum. It's not generally considered to be an improvisational instrument. I would go quite a long way in arguing the drum kit in its modern discipline is largely improvisational, but not so for the snare drum. I would argue the snare drum is predominantly a repertoire-based instrument. Nevertheless, regardless of where you sit on that particular debate, which doesn't really matter either way, engaging with the repertoire exposes you to musical ideas, rhythmic ideas, notational conventions. It forces you to develop a strong reading capability. It improves your technique by forcing you to consider the vocabulary in ways you may not have seen before, to engage with unfamiliar figures, to engage with unfamiliar sticking patterns, and strengthens every area. I really can't overstate how good it is for you as a practitioner to engage with the repertoire. So what does this mean? I've talked about this in previous episodes, but just briefly, what does this mean? Well, in a very, very simple way, this might be as simple as finding a local music shop, if any are still out there, finding a music shop and buying a book of snare drum solos. And when you get that book of snare drum solos, it's learning a little bit about the composer, who they were or who they are, what they wanted to achieve, the style they're writing in, and then quite simply opening to solo number 1 and learning it, or practicing it, or even just practicing a small portion of it. You don't have to go and learn the whole book. You don't have to master every solo. You don't have to perform every solo. But just taking time to actually work with an established, published composition will do wonders for not only your playing, but your understanding, your reading, your musical knowledge, your depth of knowledge, your theory, your rhythm knowledge, everything. So that really is, I think, the most important thing anybody can do if they are not already doing it. And this shouldn't be scary. This shouldn't be boring. This shouldn't be a chore. This should really encompass the joy of exploring the instrument we all profess to practice. This is exploring the output of generations of musicians who have dedicated their lives or large portions of their lives to learning an instrument and contributing towards the musical canon of that instrument. And I really, really don't think you can achieve a high level in any instrument if you don't engage with that. You can, of course, do it within reason to a degree and still focus on creating your own voice and improvise and all these things that some people talk about. But even if your goal is to be the most improvisational, free-spirited, freewheeling player that breaks every mold, you still need to know what those molds are in order to break them. You still need to understand the history of the instrument that's come before you. And it's the same when I did my degree. I did a degree and latterly a master's degree in philosophy. The first thing you do, year 1 undergraduate, is you study the existing philosophers. You start at the beginning. You start with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Epicurus, and you work forward because you can't make genuine contributions to a field if you don't understand the field. You've got to understand what's already out there. So I could go on about this all episode, which I have done in the past, but if you're not doing it already, I really can't encourage you strongly enough to go and buy a book of snare drum solos and start working with it. It will change your playing, I promise you. Moving forward from this, engage with the history of the instrument. You don't need to give yourself a history degree. You don't need to write theses and study papers and research papers. You don't need to go to the library and open dusty tomes and all the rest of it. But engaging a little bit with the history of the instrument, like engaging with the repertoire, can really do wonders for your understanding of what you're doing and why you're doing it and how we arrived at the place we are at now. I'll give you an example. I often bring up historical function of certain pieces of music or certain techniques when I'm teaching. When I have beginners in the studio here and I first show them a paradiddle, the confused and puzzled looks of why on earth would I learn this particular sticking pattern when I could just do it as single strokes, or I could just do it all on one hand. It never gets old. Students always seem to react the same way. These funny names and funny patterns that I've got to remember. Well, if we go into a little bit of the history of the paradiddle, it can shed a lot of light on it. It can give us an aha moment of, I understand a little bit more about why this exists. The example I always use is how the paradiddle is traditionally used to voice a march that allows the right-hand accent to align with a right step and the left-hand accent to align with a left step, and how this is just easier for a marching drummer in terms of the coordination. Furthermore, paradiddles are typically paired with flammecues in the repertoire because the flammecue syncopates the accent by a 16th note. So by combining a marching paradiddle with an accent on the beat with a flammecue, we get this really recognizable, characteristic, rudimental marching cadence. This is just an example, but when you explain this to a student and they are looking in their grade book or something at paradiddles and flammecues and wondering why it has to be so needlessly or seemingly needlessly complicated, when you uncover a little bit of this history, a little bit of the function, a little bit of the reasons that these patterns developed and stayed with us today, as I say, it can just give a little aha moment. It can turn on a few lights, illuminating things that we may otherwise have missed. So studying a little bit about the development of the snare drum, its construction, how it was used in different traditions, the traditions themselves, having a cursory understanding of the differences, the main characteristic differences between the Swiss, the French, the British, the Scottish, the American traditions, and others, how these all contributed to the global system we have today, the specific composers within that style, the developments, the unique things. These are all fascinating in their own right, but even just a cursory engagement with them, like engaging with the repertoire, can go a long way to improving our own ability, our own understanding, and I think our own appreciation of what we're doing as well. It certainly did for me. Learning a little bit about the history and the why and the how we arrived at the material we have today really helped me appreciate these composers and the techniques and the publications and the instrument itself. And this leads quite nicely into the next point, which is a natural expansion of this, which is engaging with the composers themselves, divorced slightly from the history, although obviously we like to place composers in the general historical timeline and the contributions and the context in which they worked or continue to work today. But just like with engaging with the repertoire, just like engaging with the history, engaging with the composers who have contributed major and seminal works to the discipline can really go a long way into helping us better understand our own playing, our own performances, and again, deepen our broad subject knowledge of the instrument itself. So it can really be anybody. It doesn't matter who you choose here. You can choose those you're most interested in, your favorite performers, your favorite composers, whoever wrote your favorite piece, or those who are generally considered to be the most influential in the field. I've talked about a lot of the same names. I like to talk about Pratt and Wilcoxon, William Ludwig, Shinstein, of the traditions over in America. And then there are, of course, people like De La Cluse or Tompkins and Becker, still active today. There are so many people who have contributed to the art form. And exploring their works, studying their pieces, this obviously has crossover with engaging with the repertoire, and you can combine the two here. If I were looking to study someone like Becker a little bit more, I can do this partially by studying Becker's pieces. I can work through Mudra and Lahara, or I can work through his etudes from rudimental arithmetic. And by learning their pieces, by learning Becker's pieces, I'm learning about him as a composer. I'm learning about the history. I'm learning about his ideas. I'm learning about his compositional techniques in a characteristic sense. And this furthers my understanding of composition generally, of technique generally, of the repertoire generally. It helps me place it. It helps me form a more holistic and comprehensive understanding of the art form generally. So these three points are all quite linked, and I've separated on my list. There's a line underneath these to separate the points that follow. But these three, I think, represent probably the most practical things you can do on a general level to really elevate your playing. Study the repertoire, study the history, study the composers, and often these 3 points are simultaneous. They can happen in parallel, because by studying a composer, you are studying the history and you're studying the repertoire all at the same time. But as I've said, I really can't overstate just how valuable deepening your subject knowledge of these, what you might consider slightly more academic areas, just how good that can be for your understanding of playing, and even, in some senses, your technique as well. Now, with those 3 out the way, the remaining 6 or so pieces of advice that I'm going to impart today are a lot more practical. You'll be pleased to hear. They break away from the academic and the conceptual a little bit, and they really engage with the practicalities in the day-to-day life of playing a little bit more. So the next thing I would really encourage people to do is to try to understand the mechanics of technique better. I remember not so long ago, within the past 6 or 7 years, having a feeling of really having the desire to succeed and the desire to improve and the desire to practice and the will and the time and the dedication, but feeling confused by all of the conflicting information, all of the conflicting advice, the conflicting authority figures, on a really practical level, something like where you should have your fulcrum, whether it should be an index finger or the middle finger, and you've got some world-class player telling you it should be the index finger and never the middle finger, and some other world-class player telling you it should always be the index finger and never the middle finger, or whichever, the opposite. And this used to frustrate me to no end, because I had the time, I had the will, I had the desire and the means to practice, but I often felt paralyzed by indecision because I wasn't sure I was practicing the right thing. So the best thing I did as a remedy to that was to look deeper at the mechanics of technique itself so I could form my own informed opinions. So this is asking questions like, well, regardless of where the fulcrum is, what is a fulcrum? What is it there for? What does it do? And why do I need one? If I can answer these questions competently, if I have an understanding of the answers to these questions, I might find that it doesn't really matter where the fulcrum is. So while somebody might ask me, John, where should I put my fulcrum? I can give an opinion, but I can back that opinion up with informed understanding of why I'm saying it. Now, to take this particular topic, I generally think it doesn't matter. There are world-class players who work with an index finger fulcrum, and there are world-class players who work with a middle finger fulcrum. For myself, I actually generally use both. My index finger is involved, but sometimes it feels like my middle finger is helping out, and I don't worry about it too much. What is far more important is that I understand what a fulcrum is. I understand what it does and why I need one. So as long as I make sure when I'm practicing that I have a functioning fulcrum, and I know why and I know how, that's more important, and that helps me understand why I might choose to use an index fulcrum in this context and a middle finger fulcrum in a different context, or why I might teach one way or another. Likewise, developing an understanding of the different types of grip, how they work, how they produce a stroke. How does the fulcrum change when we switch to a French position? How does the fulcrum operate in a traditional grip? How does the fulcrum change if the stick is completely in line with the forearm, or if it's coming in at a 45-degree angle, a really wide barrel on the grip position? How does this affect the use of the fingers? What should the fingers be doing? Do we want the fingertips, or do we want the sticks right up against the hand? All of these questions to a student can be really frustrating. There are so many variables. Whereas if you take a little bit more time to try to study why we have them, how they work, the mechanics of it, as I've suggested, you can start to get to a point where you can confidently answer these questions yourself because you understand the sort of broader dialectic in which they occur. So in this sense, as I have said before, technique is predominantly a matter of understanding. You gain understanding from working with repertoire, as I have said a million times, but you gain understanding by working with your hands, by looking at how the sticks interact with the drum, by looking at what happens mechanically when you throw a stick at a drum and watch it bounce. And what does letting it move out of my thumb do? What happens if my thumb stays strong? What happens if my thumb is at 90 degrees perpendicular to the stick? All these millions of tiny little details individually don't matter if we understand the broader mechanics and how they can best help us produce the stroke. Now, unfortunately, there is no quick fix to this. I've been very fortunate in that I've studied with some great players, and they've had some really interesting insights into the nature of technique. So that can be a really valuable way to go. There are many teachers who teach online who have a great degree of knowledge, a great array of things to share that can give you insights into the nature of technique. Or you can do your own research. You can sit there with stick in hand and really just take the time to watch what happens when you've got a stick in your hand and you throw it at a drum. How do I then produce a second stroke immediately after that? What has to happen in the hand? Or what has to happen in the hand if I want to do a downstroke where I get an accent but I keep the stick very, very low for a ghost note immediately after it? It's one thing asking, how do I do it? As in, oh, I don't know how to do that, I should ask somebody. And it's another saying, I don't know how to do it, but I'm going to figure it out. And I'm going to figure out by experimenting with myself. I'm going to look what happens, literally, when I hold a stick in my hand and I make this motion. As I said, there's no quick fix to this. It takes time, it takes patience, and it takes a genuine will, I think, to explore. But it is that very act of exploring that yields the greatest results, because you learn to understand things in a more intuitive way about your own body, about sticks, about the mechanics of it all. And I think this gives you a stronger knowledge and a stronger sense of progress as well. You can really get a sense of how you're improving and why there might be some things that are not quite working for you. Next, I think this comes down to the act of practicing and performing. And it's very, very simple. Be precise. The snare drum as an instrument requires, I think, a great deal of precision. All instruments require precision, but the snare drum, I think, is particularly unforgiving for sloppiness. We don't have, as an instrument, access to melody, harmony, tone. We can't play a nice tune. We can't play Happy Birthday. We can't play Twinkle Twinkle or any recognizable tune on a snare drum. What we can do, to the greatest degree, is express rhythm, express dynamic, express rhythmic ideas. And to this end, we need to make sure that our performance of these ideas, our execution, is precise. So if you are faced with a phrase, let's just take a really simple example. Let's say you're faced with a phrase that is 4/16 notes, the first of which is accented. That accent is there for a reason. You can't just ignore it and you can't just pay it lip service. That accent has to be audibly and distinctly different to the non-accent strokes that follow. So much so that the accent is really the only important stroke we play in that phrase. The three strokes that come after it are there to transition us into the next accent again. So applying this concept of precision to a very specific example might include ensuring there is a distinct and conscious and repeatable difference in the stick heights that we use to produce the accent from the taps. So when I'm practicing in this sort of hyper-focused format, I will produce every accent from a vertical position and every non-accent from a horizontal position. Now, these are 90 degrees apart. The stick begins pointing to the ceiling or the stick begins pointing forwards. And this produces the biggest practical contrast we can in the stroke type. So if I'm working through an accent phrase that I'm trying to become more familiar with, I'm consciously differentiating between the stroke heights to the biggest degree possible to ensure my precision with the dynamics there. Likewise with the rhythm. There is a difference between 16th note quintuplets and 16th note sextuplets. There is a difference between 16th note septuplets and 32nd notes within a quarter note. There is a difference. There is a difference between an open drag and a closed drag. There is a difference between a flam and a rough. All of these tiny little examples we can think about. We need to understand those differences and ensure we are actually reproducing them. It is no good seeing the drag and knowing that it is a closed drag, but performing it just as an open drag through laziness or carelessness. That's not good enough. And I think this idea of being precise kind of accompanies that phrase of that's not good enough. We need to hold ourselves to a higher standard in order to achieve a higher standard. So being precise in this manner is looking at how we are performing the thing we are working on and asking if we have sufficiently covered every aspect of that thing. Now, if that thing is very simple, comprising an accent pattern and a rhythm, is the accent clearly discernible? Is the rhythm metronomically correct? If those two things are not sufficiently good enough, then we're not doing our dues. We're not paying our dues. We're not doing our duty as a musician. And this is, I think, really how we grow. So whenever you are working on a piece of music, whenever you are working on an exercise, whenever you are just practicing, take that little bit of extra time, care, attention, and focus, and make sure you are being precise. Is there a difference between these two notes? Is there a difference between these two rhythms? Yes. What is it? Am I sufficiently reproducing that difference? In a similar vein to that, my next piece of advice would be focus on articulation and not speed. Speed is a big deal for many people. The general cry of dismay of I can't play this fast enough, I can't reproduce my doubles fast enough, or I can't play paradiddles fast enough is a very common one. And trust me, I have been there myself. I have cried that myself to great frustration over the years. But ultimately, I have come to learn that speed is a byproduct of control and articulation. You can't, I think, directly work on speed. Speed develops over the course of developing control and familiarity and articulation with what it is you are trying to perform. So if we want to increase our speed at performing something, our focus should be on improving our articulation with it, our control, making sure every stroke is produced with the same technique, making sure every stroke has its space within the rhythm, making sure every stroke is at the correct volume, at the correct metric position, and repeating that in such a way that those elements are clearly articulated each and every time we do it. If I am practicing a single stroke roll, I want to make sure that I am striving for consistency in the articulation of that roll. So are all of my strokes even in terms of the rhythm, or am I rushing and dragging some of them? Are all of my strokes even and consistent in terms of the stick height? Assuming no accents, assuming it's just a straight, flat, single stroke roll, am I producing my strokes from a uniform height? Is my left hand stick starting to stray away from the right hand and moving off to the side of the snare drum or the side of the pad? Or am I able to keep them both at the same angle, playing a uniform position every time? This articulation is linked to what I was just talking about with being precise, but it is a very pragmatic approach to playing a figure. So am I clearly articulating that drag? Am I clearly articulating the two strokes of that flam? Even though they might be very close together, we want a sharp, snappy flam. Am I clearly articulating both of them? And this, in turn, will lead to your ability to reproduce those things fast. It's in one sense, it's as simple as that. If you want to improve your speed with something, be precise and articulate. Focus on the articulation and reproducing the articulation, and over time, over repetitions with persistence, the speed will come. Likewise, in the same vein with this, it's linked to being precise, it's linked to being articulate with your strokes, is don't ignore the dynamics. I was just saying how, as an instrument, the snare drum doesn't have access to melody. We can't produce melody or pitch or tone. So we really have to focus on the two things we can produce, which is rhythm and dynamics. These are our two tools with which we actually produce music. So I've already spoken about being precise and articulate with rhythm and strokes. We really can't neglect dynamics. So when we come across a passage with accents and non-accents, we need to make sure those accents are clearly contrasted with the non-accents. Likewise, the dynamics given in the piece. Are we in a piano section? Are we in a mezzo forte or a mezzo piano or a pianissimo or a fortissimo? Is there a crescendo, and is it a poco a poco crescendo, or is it a very short, sharp crescendo? Is that an accent, or is it a marcato, or is it a tenuto? All of these different things that for a composer were really intentional choices. So in my own pieces, if I've put a tenuto there, it's for a reason. If I've put an accent next to a marcato, it is there for a reason. I want to hear the difference between the marcato accent and the normal accent. All of these little elements, yes, it comes back to being precise. Yes, it comes back to articulation, but specifically with regards to the dynamics, are really what give the performance color. It's really what makes the performance sound like music. To draw a parallel with the drum kit, those of you that play the drums might be familiar with playing a paradiddle-based groove. You've got one hand on the hi-hat and one hand on the snare drum, and you play paradiddles between the hands in that position. It's one thing to just play the paradiddles, and it's another to make sure you're differentiating between the accent strokes on the snare and the ghost notes on the snare to turn it into a groove. Without the due care and attention to those dynamics, the difference between the ghost notes and the accents, that paradiddle groove doesn't sound like a groove. It just sounds like paradiddles. So likewise, when you're working with a piece of music or when you're working on an exercise or whatever it may be, the dynamic markings are there for a reason. They are there because they contribute a great deal to the musical idea that you are trying to express. And I think it's right up there. One of the most important things, I get many drummers here in the studio who come for lessons. I'm very lucky to have people from all over the world come and study with me here. And I see people of all abilities, from the newest beginners through to existing professionals who want to touch up on a specific area. And the control of dynamics is one of the quickest ways that I can gauge somebody's general ability. Obviously, it goes much deeper than that, but it is one of the quickest ways, as I say, to get a sense of whereabouts this person is in terms of their progress. And it's hard. It is difficult to accurately control your dynamics all the time. It is a mindset you have to adopt when you are working on a piece to say, my diminuendo there was not diminuendo enough. My piano wasn't piano enough. Now, the one real practical piece of advice I can give here, it is easy to play loudly. I remember once asking Rick Dior, something of a mentor of mine at one point when I was working on some projects, and he's been very kind since in sharing his advice with me and his expertise. And in one of my lessons with him, I asked him about how to perform a loud something or other. It might have been a roll of some kind, loud double strokes. And I think in my mind, I was thinking about power. I was thinking about how to really draw out this spectacular, powerful roll. And he laughed and he said, it's easy to play loud. Don't worry about playing loud because you're already doing it. Now, whether or not it's the same loud I had in my mind, maybe I was imagining these sort of drum corps double strokes where they're coming from about 50 feet up in the air and they sound like machine gun fire. But that point always stayed with me. On a drum, indeed probably any instrument, but on a drum specifically, it is easy to play loudly. So what we really need to focus on is the opposite. We really need to focus on those strokes that need to be quiet because the loud ones are going to take care of themselves. So we're motoring through the list now. I'm at point 8 on my list here. And this one, I think, is, again, quite a practical one. And I see it all the time in my students, and I'm forever picking them up on it. Minimize unnecessary movements. This goes for whether you're a drum kit player or a snare drum player, and I think I would guess whatever instrument you might happen to play. But when we are learning something, whatever it is, any skill, we learn that thing through hyperbole, through exaggeration. We exaggerate these motions and we make sure we are doing it correctly. And that's fine. I think that's an important step. But there must come a point through sufficient practice and understanding and feedback and all the rest of it, experience, where we shed those unnecessary movements. And the times I demonstrate for my students, if I pop behind the drum kit to play through something they're working on, or I perform something on the snare drum for a student, one of the biggest pieces of, or one of the biggest comments, or the most frequent comments that comes back to me from the students is how little I move. And I'm always quite pleased with that. I'm always quite flattered by that feedback, because I've spent a lot of time trying to make sure I can perform the things I want to perform without those unnecessary movements. I don't need to swing my arms up in the air. I don't need to use my shoulders most of the time. Or if I do, it's in the smallest possible way. And again, I think this holds whether you're on a drum kit or whether you're on the snare drum. There is a surprising amount you can do with just the stick in the hands, inside the hands, fulcrum and fingers, with a minimal input from the wrists even. If you really need to, you can use the elbows and get the forearms involved. It's very, very rare we need to get the shoulders involved. And when you actually explore the mechanics of what you're doing, this comes back to point 4 earlier, understanding the mechanics of technique. When you have a good understanding of what's actually required to perform a stroke or perform this particular technique, you find that you can do it with far less movement than you originally thought. Now, this doesn't mean you should become a robot and you should force yourself to be stiff and static. We always want to remain fluid and flexible and relaxed and flowing, but that can be in a really efficient way. I suppose efficiency is the key word here. We're aiming for efficiency of movement. And over the years, I've noticed vast improvements in my own playing when I have worked on efficiency. And I've often noticed, even in some really specific circumstances, I've been working on something and doing something somewhere in my body that is completely unrelated to what I was playing. So, for example, I went through a period when I was practicing and working on particular difficult or fast passages and whatnot. I found I was grinding my teeth. Or I found, this was a really funny one, I found as I was standing there playing something, I was curling my toes inside my shoes. Or I was tilting my head over to one side. And these are all physical crutches. These are all physical coping mechanisms that ultimately don't need to happen. It's like an anxiety response. If I knew I was working on something that was difficult or fast, curling my toes or grinding my teeth was like an anxiety response to that. So when I noticed I was doing this, I had to take a conscious breath and relax it. And I found actually it wasn't helping. Of course it wasn't helping. Grinding my teeth and curling my toes is not helping me perform on the snare drum, so I don't need to do it. So minimizing these unnecessary movements goes beyond just what we're doing in the hands and the arms. It's involving a mindfulness of the body generally and saying, do I need to do that? A really common one, just before I move on, I see this all the time and it always makes me laugh. Students on the drum kit, when they're doing something with their hi-hat foot, opening a hi-hat for a particular stroke or something, and they almost throw themselves off the chair by lifting their leg into the air because they are using an entirely unnecessary motion to do that. So I will say to them, close the hi-hat, rest your foot, and then just use your ankle to just lift your toes by 1 centimeter. And that's enough just to loosen the hi-hat so that we can get the open sound we're looking for. You don't need to hurl your leg into the air. You don't need to suspend your foot above the hi-hat pedal. You can achieve the same effect much more efficiently with the tiniest of movements if we know how to do that, if we know where to look. So finally, we're down to our last 2 points here. And I think they're quite good ones, actually. Number 9 is a little bit like number 4, understanding the mechanics of technique. And it is understanding the mechanics of rhythm. As drummers, as percussionists of any variety, we really should be masters of rhythm. This is our domain. The snare drum exists as an instrument that I think represents the purest expression of rhythmic ideas. Rhythm is our domain, and so we should master it. We should understand time signatures. We should understand polyrhythms. We should understand note values and subdivisions and tuplets and nested tuplets and all the rest of it. Not just in a way that we sort of think we could get away with it, but in a way we could articulately explain to somebody else. And I found this a challenge when I first started teaching. Somebody said to me, "What's a polyrhythm?" And I would demonstrate it. And that's fine, but that's not explaining it. That is not teaching somebody what it is and how it works. It's just showing them a sound. And that's helpful. We need to be able to do that. We need to understand how it sounds, but it's not enough. Likewise, I need to be able to explain to somebody what a nested tuplet is, and why a triplet in 4/4 is not a triplet in 12/8, and why there is a dot after that note, and what both numbers of the time signature mean in every context, and why in 12/8 there are not 12 beats to the bar. You know, how many people say a time signature tells us how many beats to the bar? And that's incorrect, or at least incomplete. So it's making sure we understand rhythm to the highest possible level, as I've said, because this is our domain. Now, there are lots of resources out there you can do this with or use. I think one of the most important for me was actually Gary Chaffee's material. He's got a series of books called the Patterns series. And two in particular, I think, were really important to my own development of this. That was sticking patterns and rhythm and meter patterns. And both of these books treated tuplets, or I should say subdivisions, really. They treated time signature and subdivisions, meter generally, as all being equal. So there was no dominance or preference given to 16th notes in 4/4. It was just as likely when you turn the page that the next sticking study would be in 7/8 or utilize 7 notes to the beat than it would be in 2/4 or 4/4. And I found that really challenging at first, and then I loved it. I found it refreshing, and I changed the way I viewed rhythm generally. So to me now, a quintuplet is no different to a sextuplet to 4/16 notes. It is just a variety of rhythm. It's just a way we subdivide a beat. And that is liberating in terms of my performance, it's liberating in terms of my composing, and it's liberating in terms of my teaching, because I feel confident when I teach these things. Of course, we can also achieve this through working with repertoire and working with material that explores these rhythms. In the book, The Snare Drum Virtuoso, I've got an entire section dedicated to rhythmic studies. And they look at subdivisions, they look at polyrhythms. And from a rhythmic perspective, they are very, very challenging. Some of them are so challenging that I couldn't perform them to you even now, but I could explain them to you. And they are there to be treated as study exercises to show you what can happen when we understand rhythm, to show you the effect we can produce when we can manipulate rhythm through comprehensive understanding. So really, I think as drummers, as percussionists, there's no excuse not to. We really should master our domain, which ultimately is rhythm. Finally then, and I think I have saved the best till last. This is the last piece of advice that I will leave you with, but I really think it's an important one because it tackles so many areas and it tackles things that people are generally concerned about in their own day-to-day playing. So number 10 is always make sure you are practicing towards a specific performance. Adopting this approach revolutionized the way I practice, and to this day, it dominates the way I practice. When I was younger, I spent just as long trying to devise practice routines for myself as I did actually practicing. I had notebooks and computer documents and spreadsheets trying to plan the perfect practice routine down to the minute, and it just does not work, and it never will. If you are one of these musicians, if you're one of these drummers that does this, please stop and pay attention to what I'm saying here. It will not work for one very simple purpose. Practice, to be effective, must be goal-orientated. If we cannot reach a goal, we are not going to do the practice effectively for a variety of reasons. Physical, psychological, mental and emotional. There are so many reasons, but without a goal, we will not do the practice and it will not benefit us. So we must always make sure we are working towards something that we can stamp and say, yes, it's done. And now I can move on. And by far the best way to do this, which links us nicely back round to point number 1, right at the beginning, is to work towards a piece of music that you are going to perform. Now, that performance need not be in a theatre to 100 people or 1,000 people. It might just be you on your own recording yourself with your phone, or it might be to your friend, or it might be to your mum. It doesn't matter. Take a piece you are working on and decide that you are going to see this through to completion, and I am going to take this piece to performance standard, and I am going to perform it. Now, for me, I did this with everything once I got involved with it. What I mean is, once I started practicing in this way, it changed the way I practiced forever, and I started recording performances of what I was working on. So that's why if you look back at the last few years of my YouTube channel, the majority of them are snare drum performances, because they represent the things I was practicing. So if I've done a performance of 3 camps, that's because I was practicing 3 camps at the time. If I've done a performance of Pratt's Ginger Snap, it's because I was practicing Pratt's Ginger Snap at the time. And I decided that I was going to take it through to completion and actually perform it. So having that end product, I'm going to take this to the point where I can point a camera at myself, record the performance, and then release it to the public as a professional contribution as an artist, really changed the way I approached the piece. It meant I had to pay attention to all of the things I've talked about. I had to pay attention to precision and dynamics and articulation and speed and technique and all the rest of it. I had to understand what I was playing, the history, the composer, the intention, the context. So this last point really brings it all together and combines it into one. And there is no reason not to dedicate yourself to practicing in this way all the time. Now, when you do this, that doesn't mean don't practice exercises, but it means use exercises that are conducive to the piece you're working on. So if you are working on a piece that just, to be really simplistic, if you're working on a piece that happens to have a really fast double stroke section, go and find exercises that are related to double strokes. But don't let that be the be-all and end-all of your practice. Link it back to the section you're working on, and you can split your time, do a little bit of time with the exercises, and then bring that back to the piece you're working on and plug it into the larger general process. But always have as your end goal the piece of music that you are going to perform. And I really think if you dedicate yourself to this, you will notice differences straight away. Because on the one hand, you will find that you will no longer be practicing many of the things that you thought you should be. So when I was back in the days of writing extensive practice routines for myself, I filled it with things that I felt I should practice just as a box ticking exercise. So I should be practicing a left foot clave, and I should be practicing sight reading, and I should be practicing Latin, and I should be practicing my jazz soloing, and I should be practicing my big band charts, and all the rest of it. When you start focusing your practice on an individual piece of music, you of course have to give up practicing a lot of those things. But what you gain for that is real focus on things that matter. Now, I can tell you from experience, for example, I spent hours and hours and hours, weeks and months, if not years of my life, practicing a left foot clave on a drum kit so that I could play and solo and do the rest of it while maintaining a left foot clave. And I have never used that in any musical, professional, or recording situation. Now, that's not to say I wasted it, but it is to say that maybe I could have spent that time in a slightly more productive way that was geared towards something that I could ultimately perform and produce. And if you are working on the right things, if you are working on a piece of music that contains a lot of the things that you want to improve, you're getting the best of both worlds, because you are working on things that you already find difficult and you are improving them with a set end goal. You're doing it in the right way, you are improving your knowledge of the repertoire, and you are actually going to have something to perform at the end of it. So I would really encourage you, even just try it for a month. Choose one piece of music, one snare drum solo, and say, okay, I'm just going to try it. I'm not going to do anything else for a month. I'm just going to practice this piece and try to get it to the point where I can perform it. And I can promise you that will change your playing in ways you wouldn't think about. It will make you focus on things you would previously neglect. It will make you pay attention to things that you wouldn't normally have to think about, because when you start practicing it and rehearsing it and maybe recording yourself in draft performances, you will spot things that just aren't up to performance standard that you then have to go back and reflect on and change and practice. So that really does bring us back round to the beginning. practice towards performance, which takes us right back round to engaging with the repertoire. So just as a very quick recap, running through all those points again, because I realize I've been going on at length today. Engage with the repertoire, engage with the history of the instrument, engage with the composers. Understand the mechanics of technique, be precise in everything you do, articulate, don't focus on speed, focus on controlled articulation, focus on the dynamics to the highest level you can, minimize unnecessary movements and focus on efficiency, ergonomics of movement, understand and ultimately master rhythm, as that is the domain in which we are working, and always practice towards a performance. Always practice with an end goal in mind, preferably a piece of music you are actually going to perform in some form. So I think that's it. I've really been blathering on at length today, so I really hope this has been of value to some of you. The Snare Drum Virtuoso is available worldwide. It is a vast collection of technical studies and pieces of music that are aimed at people really wishing to engage with their technique in a really organic and music-related way. It's available worldwide, digitally, physically, spiral-bound edition, whatever, you name it, you can find it. If you have any questions or queries, please get in touch at jonathancurtis.co.uk. I said at the end of the last episode, I'm thinking of doing a sort of Q&A session. So if you have any questions you would like me to consider, please just get them to me. YouTube, Reddit, email, website, however you'd like to get in touch. I'd love to hear your questions or just pop along to say hello. Everything about me is at my website, jonathancurtis.co.uk. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Snare Drum Virtuoso.